The next speaker, in my view, is one of the bravest Norwegian intellectual at the moment. He has a podcast. He's loved by, I would say, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. His podcasts are hosting people like Jeffrey Sachs, Americans, Russians, Ukrainians, Palestinians. But this time he is going to, and I have challenged him on the topic of Russophobia. When Glenn Diesen went to Drammen, or was going to Skien next week, there was an uproar. How can you invite a man who has written for a Russian television or a Russian paper? And Glenn says, I'm an intellectual. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, on that, actually, when they invited me to Skien, I actually told them in the first email, I'm happy to come, but please know that Helsinki committee will try to cancel it once they know I'm speaking. So they were warned. But today, my topic is the media coverage of the Ukrainian war. And well, it's my key argument that a free and independent media is obviously imperative for democracy. And the danger we often face during wars is that journalists tend to transform themselves into information warriors. And why is this? Well, when human beings experience external threats, it triggers the most profound instinct in human nature, which is to seek safety in the group. You divide the world into us and them, and you have to express then complete loyalty to our group. So often even well-intentioned, but this is also where propaganda is often born, as it then demands full group loyalty, no dissent, and we often see that rationality also ends. So journalists stop reporting on objective reality, and every conflict tends to be simplified and dumbed down to a narrative of good versus evil, goodies and baddies, or as our propaganda tends to be focused on, liberal democracies versus authoritarianism. So all the complexities of the world simplified through a very simple binary lens. And this is problematic because more than a century ago, we had Walter Lippmann, one of the first scholars on political propaganda. He observed then the British propaganda during the Russian Civil War, in which everything was also contrasted as a struggle of good versus evil, and the narrative had to be adjusted as such. And he concluded that the positive aspect of propaganda was obviously the ability to mobilize public support if you think you're in conflict with evil. But obviously, he became, after a while, very critical of propaganda rather than a proponent, as due to the negative aspect of propaganda, which is that it prevents any workable peace. If you believe that you're in conflict or in a struggle between good and evil, then he argued victory is the only path to peace. So meanwhile, mutual understanding, negotiations, compromise, this become all denounced as treasonous, something you shouldn't do when you're faced with evil. So this is why our adversaries are always reincarnation of Hitler. We're always living in the 1930s, because when you face pure evil, then peace is created with military victory, and you cannot talk to evil. This is appeasement. And this is also, I think, a very valuable lesson for the Ukraine war. As well, to paraphrase, or actually to directly quote NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, more weapons is the path to peace, as he then rejects diplomacy and negotiations. Now, we therefore see that propaganda is often or largely dependent on appealing to morality and the best in human nature in order to make us do the worst. And it also plays on emotions, on our compassion. And indeed, we should have compassion, because what's happening in Ukraine now is horrific, and it's a human tragedy. So we should all go from the common goal of putting an end to this war. However, I would also add that when NATO develops seemingly moral slogans such as the war can only be over when Russia leaves Ukraine, this actually translates into a rejection of negotiations and leaving then capitulation or endless war as the only two alternatives. And it's a bit like when the European Union states that it supports a ceasefire in Gaza, but first Hamas must capitulate, disarm, and dismantle itself. So it becomes a moral framing of genocide. And again, we see that the media isn't challenging any of these narratives. Instead, over and over again, they merely amplify it. And the question can be asked if we have been propagandized. President Zelensky's former advisor, Arestovich, he recently argued on Twitter, that is, that Ukrainians had become deeply propagandized. As he suggested, they do a simple test. If you're able to articulate the position of your adversary, which is Russia, are you able to do this? If you're not, then you're likely propagandized. Well, I would argue that this is also a perfect description of what's been happening in the West, where everything is always contrasted as a struggle with evil. So in the past 2 years, or even the past 30 years for that matter, have any of us ever heard our government or media clearly articulate an honest position of the position of Russia? Or even be able to, are any of us even able to articulate the position of Russia in society? As I found time and time again, even trying to explain the position of Russia is then denounced as legitimizing it, in which then obviously both censorship and cancellation should follow immediately after. And often, sadly, we see that the journalists are often first in line in calling for this kind of censorship. So, in the struggle between good and evil, we see that our hatred becomes virtuous, and often self-delusion becomes patriotic. I've attempted to explain basic things like the sanctions aren't working. If I do this, I find out if you criticize the sanctions, well, then you're undermining public trust in it, and this is what Russia wants, hence you're a Putinist. So objective reality can't really be properly expressed, and the conclusions, if the conclusion doesn't support our side against evil. And this is then a huge problem, because you can't really criticize NATO's role in this war unless you are accused of repeating Russian propaganda, taking Russian money, or at least just being a Putinist. So today I would therefore like to ask or propose the following question about our media. Do they act as journalists or as propagandists? Now, you can set indicators for this. A journalist publishes stories if they can fulfill two criteria. That is, if it's true and if it's of public interest. Now, in contrast, we see propagandists aim to mobilize public support for war. So we can then look at the three, I would argue, most important media narratives of this war. First, it was unprovoked, as NATO expansion, NATO had nothing to do with it. NATO's merely there to support, that's the second one. NATO's merely there to support the democratic will of Ukrainians. And third, it's not possible to negotiate with Russia. So we can look at each of these. The first narrative, which is it was unprovoked. Russia's invasion did not have anything to do with NATO. Well, this simply ignores, or requires that the media ignores 30 years of recorded history. As we had a sea of top American and European officials warning that NATO expansion could trigger a war. We had defense ministers, foreign ministers, CIA directors, ambassadors, other top politicians were saying this for 30 years. This has not entered our narrative. One of the most precise predictions came in 2008 from William Burns. He was the US ambassador to Moscow, and now he's the director of the CIA. And he wrote that attempting to expand NATO to Ukraine would spark a civil war and then likely trigger a Russian invasion, even though this is something the Russians would not want to do. Again, not a Putinist, but the director of the CIA. And why? Why civil war? Well, if you're dependent on suppressing the Russian-friendly population, you're going to have a civil war. And why would it trigger a Russian invasion? Well, for the same reason, if the Russians or the Chinese would start to build a military alliance with Mexico and send in its weaponry on the border, the Americans might act in the same way. This is not to legitimize anything or give my stamp of approval, but one also have to adjust to reality that this is how great powers behave. And indeed, this was also largely supported by the Germans. The German ambassador to the US warned in 2008 that this could spark a civil war in Ukraine, and Angela Merkel herself said that offering NATO membership to Ukraine would be interpreted as, quote, a declaration of war. And still, we hold on to our narrative unprovoked. Russia never saw this as a threat. Furthermore, in the months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was a spectacularly poor media coverage. A few stories which never made it into the Norwegian papers, at least, or the Western media. In 2021, there was a massive naval exercise involving both Ukraine and NATO to bring them to the same standards, in which Zelensky's advisor argued it was a preparation for war with Russia. In November of 2021, the US and Ukraine signed the Charter on Strategic Partnership, which would give the Americans further stronger presence in Ukraine. Also, it was envisioned that this would help to bring back Crimea under Kyiv's rule. In other words, return it from the control of the Russians. At this point, the former advisor of the French President Sarkozy, he warned, again, there's a quote, "This convinced Russia that it must attack or be attacked." Again, we don't have to agree with any of these assessments, but surely it belongs in the narrative. And this is also very much, this view was also supported by the former head of Russia analysis at the CIA, who stated in December of 2021, so 2 months before the invasion, that Russia will likely invade because the US is entrenching itself further and further in Ukraine. The US and NATO are modernizing the Ukrainian ports to fit their warships. And his argument was the risk of not invading was becoming greater than the risk of invading. Again, the head of Russian analysis at the CIA, obviously I also assume he's not a Putinist. But we then had Biden and Putin trying to find a way out of this conflict before the war. And as they were meeting, we have Kurt Volker, the former US ambassador to NATO, and also the US special representative for Ukraine negotiations. His argument was, we cannot make a deal with the Russians because peace is appeasement. And he wrote, and again, also quote, "Success is confrontation." That's what he wanted from the peaceful meetings. Again, this is because Putin, as our newspapers remind us every day, he is the new Hitler. We cannot have any deals. So, again, why is this reported? Why is this excluded from the reporting? It certainly would amount to having some public interest in this, is of the interest of the public, but it also undermines the war narrative. So we don't hear any of this. The second narrative, of course, is NATO is simply a third party. It's helping Ukraine. This is, of course, a very important narrative as we supply weapons, endless amount of weapons to the Ukrainians. And this also has to be asked whether or not we're actually helping. Between 1991 and 2014, every poll, either if it's done by Ukrainians or the West, it showed that approximately 20% of Ukrainians wanted NATO membership. NATO itself released a report in 2011 explaining why this was a huge threat to NATO-Ukrainian relations. As they wrote in the report, that often they find now that less than 20% of Ukrainians want to be a part of NATO, and the government has made neutrality its law. So this is a huge threat or a huge problem. Yet the media insists that Ukraine's dream was always to join NATO and escape the shadow of Russia, and this is what we had to help them to do. And that's what we also did in 2014 when the US and several of its allies backed a coup. The most open one in modern times, I would add. American leaders were even caught on tape planning the coup and discussing who should be in the new government and who should have to remain outside. And everything they discussed happened just as they planned, even though this was released weeks before they even toppled Yanukovych. Now, in the media, it insists this wasn't even a coup. We were helping Ukraine to support a democratic revolution. Despite toppling a democratically elected government, unconstitutional coup, by the way, and it didn't even have support by the majority. As BBC at that time noted, not even the Maidan protest had support from the majority of Ukrainians. But we never heard about this ever again, so we're still stuck on a democratic revolution. And then we see an American-installed government as the US helped Ukraine by supporting an anti-terrorist operation. This was against the Eastern Ukrainians who opposed the legitimacy of the coup. And this, of course, killed thousands of Ukrainians. In the media, we often found a very dismissive tone. They were Russian agents. They were simply acting on behalf of the Russian interests. And the media, we also found, didn't report on any of the atrocities. Now, again, these were the bad Ukrainians. They were the ones who were opposing it, of course. So the US helped Ukrainians also by purging them of Russian influence, more assistance, supporting the purge of political opposition parties, arrest of its main opposition leader, banning of opposition media, cultural purge, everything from the Russian language, books, music, and of course the Orthodox Church. Now, at this point, we also saw Washington helping Ukraine with its democratic governance by constructing a new government. Also, many things which the media did not inform us. For example, after the coup, Natalia Yarescu, who was an American and also working for the US State Department, she was also actually working at the US Embassy in Kyiv before the coup. After the coup, however, she got a new job. She became the finance minister of Ukraine. So one day you're representing America in Kyiv, the next day you're representing Ukraine, you're the finance minister, and she got the citizenship on the same day as she got the job. Now she's no longer finance minister, so of course she's no longer there. Again, how would the media cover this if the Russians would have done it? Would this not have been called a colonial government? Again, we also saw an American state prosecutor in New York. He became Ukraine's Minister of Economic Development and Trade. We also had other foreign nationals linked to the US who took a key position in the post-coup government. Even the general prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, he gave an interview in which he argued the US was running Ukraine like a colony. All new government appointees had to be approved by Washington if the Americans hadn't put forward these candidates themselves. And as we know, the general prosecutor, Shokin, was later fired very publicly. Biden stood on stage and bragged how he was able to get him fired. And this, of course, happened after Shokin had investigated the Ukrainian gas company Burisma, where Joe Biden's son happened to get a job after the coup, even though he had no background in gas or Ukraine. So again, coincidences, but still, one would think media could have some interest. The media then, in terms of the intelligence agencies, we had only had one report from the Washington Post, and this is the Washington Post who then wrote, quote, "Since 2015, the CIA has used tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's security services into potent allies against Moscow." Again, also quite significant to understand what has happened since, but also now evading the media picture. Then for more than a decade, the Americans now armed and trained far-right extremist groups, as these would never compromise with Russia, and this gave Washington a very powerful veto over any possible peace movement in Ukraine. Now, what we don't mention often is that both Poroshenko and Zelensky, they ran on peace platforms and initially attempted to implement the Minsk peace agreement before the American-funded right-wing groups were able to threaten them and reverse their positions. Now, again, you don't have to take Russia's side in order to think that perhaps this was not the best thing to do in the name of peace. For example, Zelensky, he won 73% of the votes, a huge landslide in a victory. And he ran on implementing the peace agreement and the respective cultural language rights of Donbass. Now, but he then had to reverse this after he was very publicly threatened by the far right. And again, or as the media like to say, the US helped Ukraine not to capitulate to Russia, so could ignore its voters. And NATO countries then, also as we have learned, but not through the media, is that the NATO countries sabotaged the Minsk agreement for 7 years. That is, Western leaders, they insisted for 7 years that the Minsk agreement was the only path to peace and was negotiated by Germany, France. However, later on, both Merkel and Hollande confirmed that they didn't expect it to be implemented. It was merely to buy time to build a Ukrainian army. Again, a journalist might ask the question, if we say that the Minsk agreement is the only peaceful or the only path to peace, and we then sabotaged this path to peace for 7 years, could this have contributed to the war? Well, it didn't, but it's a good question. But again, all of these references to helping Ukraine has always put Ukraine on a path to war. So on the third and last narrative, it's this idea that it's not possible to negotiate with Russia. This is why war is the only path to peace. There has to be only weapons. There's no other way to solve this. Except for those who visit the website of the Ukrainian government, who will read that on the first day of the invasion, on the 25th of February, Zelensky confirmed he was contacted by Moscow. They wanted to restart negotiations. The only thing important for the Russians was neutrality. That means no NATO expansion. And Zelensky said, sure, we're willing to discuss this, no preconditions. And on the third day of the invasion, on the 27th of February, the Russians and Ukrainians agreed. They were going to hold peace negotiations without any preconditions. At the exact same time, the American spokesperson, Ned Price, makes it clear the United States does not support any peace negotiations without preconditions. Russia first have to capitulate, pull out all your forces, and then we'll talk to you. But nonetheless, the Russians and Ukrainians began their peace negotiations. And at this point in time, the US and UK openly, well, not openly, well, they sabotage this peace agreement. It's not mentioned by the media, and if it is, it's denounced as Russian propaganda. However, the head of Zelensky's own parliamentary group confirms this was the case. The former advisor of Zelensky confirms it. It's reported in the Ukrainian media. The two main mediators also confirmed this, the former Prime Minister of Israel and the Foreign Minister of Turkey, both having the same story. They were close to peace. The most important thing for the Russians was neutrality. They were willing to negotiate on and compromise on everything else. But, as they both said, both the Israelis and the Turks, the British and Americans saw an opportunity to kill Russians and to degrade a strategic rival. So, and fighting with Ukrainians. So they didn't want this peace, and they told this to Zelensky: "We'll not support this peace, but if you want to fight the Russians, we'll give you all the weapons you want." It's still denied by some, even though Boris Johnson even wrote articles in the Wall Street Journal arguing against a bad peace. You had the academic Neil Ferguson interviewing American and British officials, who then confirmed that strategic defeat of Russia and regime change in Moscow was now the only acceptable outcome in Washington and London. And just the final one, because this can go on for a while. General Harald Kujat is the former chief of staff of the German armed forces. That means the boss of the entire German army, the Bundeswehr. And he was, by the way, he was also the chairman of NATO military committee. He has been arguing very openly that the United States and NATO instigated this war deliberately and then put a lot of effort into sabotaging all negotiations. And the reason why? Because this was an opportunity to fight Russia with Ukrainians. Now, we don't have to agree with his analysis, but we should ask ourselves, why are we not allowed to hear his arguments? Why does he have to be censored? Is the former chairman of NATO's military committee and the leader of the Bundeswehr also a Putinist? Is he paid by Moscow? Again, it's very strange that this falls outside the narrative. And the military leadership in Ukraine, by the way, they also complained that they didn't want to do the disastrous counteroffensive during the summer, but they said they were pressured by the US and NATO. And why? Well, we kind of know why already. One after another, American leaders have been coming out saying that this is a great war. It's a cheap war. It's a good way of degrading a strategic rival, the Russians, which will also weaken China in the long run, and all without losing any American troops. So it's a good deal. Even NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, he went to the US about 2 weeks ago, and he was trying to make a case for continuing funding the war, and he said this is also a good deal. We get to kill, well, he said we can degrade Russia as a strategic rival, and it also benefits American arms manufacturers. So again, no one in the media breaks the ranks. And the one thing we could actually do to help Ukrainians, which I would argue would be to actually offer Russia some basic security guarantees, which would be a huge bargaining chip for the Ukrainians if they would want to negotiate and get ideally some territory back as well. However, this will not even be discussed by the journalists. So lastly, I would just like to ask if we've seen any critical questions at all from the media. Because NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said over and over again that Russia did not invade Ukraine because of NATO expansion, it had nothing to do with it. Until September of last year, when he said, oh yes, Putin invaded because he feared NATO in Ukraine. And he gave them an option, do not give neutrality to Ukraine or we'll invade. And we said no. So you can't have it both ways. And a good journalist should perhaps ask which one. We also say that Ukraine should join NATO. It wouldn't trigger World War III. No, it would make the Russians pull away because Russia would not dare to attack a NATO country. However, we must also help Ukraine fight Russia, because if Ukraine falls, then Russia will go after Poland and other NATO countries next. So again, you can't have it both ways. The only common denominator is that Russia is very, very bad and we can't trust it, but logically it doesn't make much sense. We also heard that Biden argued previously, no F-16s, this would trigger World War III, we were told. Now, a day or two ago, Stoltenberg went out and gave a speech explaining that, yes, well, not only are we sending F-16s, but NATO will approve them being used against Russian territory, which means that our F-16s can now be bombing Russian cities, which not that long ago, even giving the F-16s would trigger World War III. Again, no journalist seems to be worried about a pending nuclear war. And then, of course, we had the spectacular attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline, the greatest attack on European energy infrastructure, and it was called an act of war, until the US admitted it was not Russia, and then the entire collective media lost all interest. And as the Washington Post interviewed a European official, if we dig too much, he said, we're going to find things we don't like, so we stop asking questions. Apparently the media as well. And also, just lastly, at the beginning of this war, we're told we're giving weapons to the Ukrainians as well, to strengthen their hand when it's time for negotiations. 2 years into the war, no negotiations. So again, I can go on, but I would argue, has the hapless media actually asked any critical questions of these very startling contradictions? Not really. So yeah, this is why my conclusion is largely that the mainstream media has not acted as journalists. They've acted very much as war propagandists. Thank you.